Today I'm seeing my Vietnamese client. I can speak Vietnamese and that's my background. So I'm Viet Australian. I speak conversational Vietnamese, so it's not that great. I can read a little bit of it, but it's not that great either. My emotional language and vocabulary, Vietnamese vocabulary around emotional experiences is not extensive either. So I can say really basic things like happy, sad, shocked, traumatized, but I don't think I would know how to say things like, anxiety or depression even. I can just emphasize and say really, really sad. My family came here as boat people. They migrated here in 1982 and then I came along in 1984. So I was born in Australia. I grew up speaking Vietnamese and being very entrenched in the Vietnamese culture, but also in the white Australian culture. So growing up in Australia, especially in school, I kept my culture very separate from being at school. So the language that we spoke at home, the things that we ate, the way that we did things was sort of kept in that box. And then when I would go to school, I would just assimilate into white Australian culture and try to blend in with the culture that the school had, as well as the culture of how kids were being raised in Australia. So, they would be able to go to sleepovers and they would have a lot of parties and get-togethers, whereas we didn't have that sort of culture, and we would just, after school, we'd just go home and go back into family life, and having a social life outside of that wasn't encouraged. Those worlds were kept very separate. When I'm speaking Vietnamese, I associate it with like a very primitive language. I associate it with like the language coming from the heart, like deep within, like on a primitive level. So it's a very emotional thing. And I relate it to me being a small child, because the people in my life who were Vietnamese were, my parents or aunties or uncles or older people in my life. So I would speak Vietnamese to those people, so I would address them with respect and according to their ranking. Whereas I would speak English to friends and people who were not Vietnamese, and I would just speak to them openly in English. So if I were to speak to a Vietnamese client and tap into that part of me, it almost feels too vulnerable and too revealing, and almost like I would take on the position of a small child rather than a professional therapist. I found that really difficult to navigate. I imagined that it would be triggering for me to see a Vietnamese client simply because it just taps into that part that's kept very separate from my everyday life. So going back into that would feel too intimate in a way. But this year I decided to challenge myself and thought, I wonder what it would be like to tap into that part of me and utilize my therapy skills in a way that felt not authentic, but just a little bit more revealing in a way. I've been able to do my sessions in a way that's been very playful. I've been really transparent around the things that I don't understand. I go in there with my broken Vietnamese, we make jokes together, and we somehow understand each other, working through themes around domestic violence, depression, and transitioning into new life and new culture here in Australia. It's been fumbling around with the bus system and learning how to navigate things, and I don't normally talk about those sorts of things in everyday life. I immediately tapped into my family story and all the stories I heard from my parents and my sisters growing up and their experiences with migrating over to Australia. So when that tapped into me, I imagined them at the bus stops and I imagined them with their broken English, and I just had to fight back tears. I found myself caught off guard in that way and feeling quite emotional. I did contain it and I was regulated. It puts me in a very vulnerable position. I feel like it's a little bit too intimate in a way, mainly because it taps into areas that are filled with trauma, are not fully navigated within myself. It just reminds me too much of my family story that has been kept in a different box for so long now.
Take a train ride just to see you, ride for hours just to please you. You don't know how much I need you, 'cause you're my home away from home, away from home, away from being alone. Run away from home, why don't you?
It's Tuesday and I'm driving into work. I've just got a short shift this afternoon and should still be home in time for dinner, which will be nice. I've got a big day tomorrow, Wednesday, so we have 2 meetings and I think 3 or 4 interviews back to back, so it's gonna be a big day.
I remembered recently a book that I read called The Best We Could Do, written by T. Boy, and she wrote the book in sort of comic style, so they're all pictures and words that she drew and wrote. And she talks about how her parents migrated over to America and all of the hardships that they went through migrating over, and also talks about the hardships that they experienced as parents of young children migrating over. And at the end of the book, she is a grown woman in America and she becomes a mother herself, and she goes through the whole birth process with her baby, which you can imagine is quite a big, intense and primitive process, and she has a lot of difficulty breastfeeding, and it's just chaotic in the hospital. You have doctors going in and out, but she's finally at the end left alone with her baby, and she has a moment to breathe and she addresses her baby for the first time. So she talks to her baby, and throughout the whole book the dialogue is mainly in English when she's talking, and when she's referring to her parents or other people talking, she'll put Vietnamese words in there. but this is the first time that I can remember in the book that she speaks in Vietnamese, so she speaks it directly to her baby. So it's the scene here, but she looks at her baby and she says, "Con ơi, mẹ nè," and that makes me feel emotional just saying that, but it means my baby, mum is here. And in this part of the book she says, "I could hear echoes of my mother's voice speaking to me in my own childhood, but I could feel the voice coming from my own throat." So I think it really highlights how primitive that language can be for an immigrant as well, for someone who's moved over to here who belongs in both cultures. I found that part of the book very touching and very emotional. I read it when I was at the hairdresser one day and I couldn't stop the tears from falling out of my eyes. But yes, I would really highly recommend this book. It illustrates what I've been trying to describe about what it's like for second generation Vietnamese or other cultures, what it's like to speak our language when the main spoken language that we speak is English every day. Well, you speak really good English, eh? For an Asian. Where are you from? What country are you from? Where are you really from? Do you like it here in Australia? Konnichiwa! Ding dong dang! I can't take you to meet my family because my grandma hates Asians. I didn't realise that you guys could actually vote, because I thought you were like migrants or something, immigrants. Yeah, I don't really like that fringe on you, it makes you look really Asian. That boy over there said that you're pretty for an Asian, so you've got potential. Do you know that secretly Asians shouldn't be allowed to heat up their food in the microwave at work because they bring really weird stuff to work and it really smells really weird. It stinks out the whole office. He's only going out with you because he's got yellow fever, like he's got the oriental flavour. It's just a phase. Oh, you're from Thailand. Are you a lady boy? You're a Saigon whore. Are you a mail order bride? Are you even Asian? Like, I can't even tell the difference really. I don't see colour, I don't see like Asianness in you. I didn't even realise that you were Asian. Don't worry, you're not like the other Asians. Like, you're different to the other Asians. We think you're cool. How come you don't have like an Asian nose? You look more kind of like Indian or something. Do you like fried rice? Hello! Look at her slippers. No offense, but you're so Asian. My parents both came to Australia when they were about 17 years old and both went to Melbourne and studied university there, and that's where they met. Both my parents had about 10 to 15 years to assimilate and become quite westernised when they moved to Australia. My mum moved in with an Australian couple and my dad lived with his auntie and uncle, and his auntie was Anglo-Australian. So it was about 10 to 15 years after they migrated to Melbourne that I came along. My mum's from Thailand and my dad's from Indonesia, and both have Chinese heritage. Because both of my parents had quite a lot of time to assimilate to Australian culture and become quite westernised before I was born, I didn't have a strong sense of connection or immersion to either of my parents' culture. I used to speak fluent Thai when I was little, and as soon as I started kindergarten and school I stopped. So I think I refused to speak Thai even at home to my mum, and she must have followed my lead. Sadly, that language is lost now. I don't speak any Thai at all, and I can understand a little bit, but it's mostly gone. It wasn't until after age 10 that I actually felt that I was different. When I was in primary school in Melbourne, it was very multicultural and there were lots of Vietnamese, Greek, Italian children in the school, so I didn't feel different at all. It wasn't until my parents separated and my mum, brother and I moved to Brisbane that it was a real culture shock, and I noticed the difference, especially on the north side of Brisbane. In the late 80s, there were virtually no Asian people around. In my primary school and in my high school, I would be one of only 2 Asian people in the whole grade or the whole school. So I didn't really have a template to know how to be. I didn't have many Asian friends at all. We had lots of Indonesian friends. They were family friends growing up in Melbourne, but once we moved to Brisbane, we were really isolated. So all of my friends were white, and I worked really hard, especially in high school, to fit in and to be as white as possible. So I didn't have any close Asian friends through the last couple of years of primary school, through high school, and even through university. So Steen was the first close Asian friend that I made, and having that closeness with Steen really impacted me in ways that I'm only really reflecting on and realizing now. I didn't learn how to cook from my mum, and I love Asian food. It's my comfort food. So a lot of the Asian dishes that I know how to cook are actually Steen's recipes. It was nice to have a friendship with someone who had a shared understanding of what it was like to be Asian and to be raised really differently to our Australian Western peers. We were taught not to speak out for ourselves, and as a result, I think we weren't as confident in ourselves and didn't know how to necessarily be assertive or put healthy boundaries in place for ourselves, especially in relationships. Now that I'm almost 40 years old, I can reflect on the fact that I feel really differently about being Asian in this stage of life. I'm not ashamed anymore, and I think there's been a lot of work done internally to help me discover a bit more of who I am, what I want, and how to be in the world. I do think that a big part of that discovery and finding my grounding in being an Asian Australian has landed through my friendship with Steen and being able to come together and work through a lot together through our conversations, the meals that we share together, through expressing ourselves together in our business and in our friendship and relationally with our friends and partners and families, and just having that ally.
Don't give up on love. I know that you're tired